Welcome to tonight's video, Unit 4, Part 1, talking about functions. So the first part of the video talks about the difference between a relation and a function. All equations are relations. A relation is any set of ordered pair. So any equation in two variables is a relation. A function is a special type of relation in which every element of the domain has a unique or only one element in the range. So some examples here. If you notice, number one, zoom in out a little bit. Number one is a relation because if you notice, the element in the domain 1 has two range values of 2 and 4. Number 2 is a function because every element in the domain has exactly one range value. Number 3 is a relation because the element 1 has two range values. Number 4, that is a relation because if you put in a number for x, like 1, well, you could get 2 for y or 0 for y. The domain for this, the domain for x is basically, it has to be greater than or equal to 0 because that's the absolute value. The range is all real numbers because you could put anything in the absolute value. Number 5 is a function. You can put anything in for x, and then you get greater than or equal to 0 for y. Number 6 is a function. It's a square root function. Remember, underneath the radical has to be greater than or equal to 0, so 3x minus 4 has to be greater than or equal to 0. And then you solve that for the domain. The range, remember, this has to be positive, right? So you go negative 2 times greater than or equal to 0 plus 5. Well, negative 2 times 0 is 0, but negative 2 times infinity is negative infinity. So that flips the inequality. And then you add 5. Well, negative infinity plus 5 is negative infinity. 0 plus 5 is 5. And that's how you get the range. The next part talks about the vertical line test. If a vertical line intersects the graph of an equation only once, then the graph is a function. So that's how you determine if the graphs are functions or not a function. So here are some examples. I'm not going to go through every one, but notice a circle is not a function because a vertical line goes through twice. Actually, this is an ellipse. Here's a circle. Sideways v is not a function. Sideways parabola is not a function. This s is not a function. A hyperbola is not a function. And the hyperbola this way is not a function. They have to pass the vertical line test. So then function notation. So function notation is just a way to write a function. If it's written in function notation, you're guaranteed that the equation is a function. So the first letter is the name. So f of negative 3 means you substitute in negative 3 into the f function. So this is negative 12 minus 9, which is negative 21. Now the ordered pair would be negative 3 and negative 21. G of negative 1 means you take 5 times negative 1 minus 3, which is negative 8. Uh, 7, negative 9, because the h function, whatever you put in for w, you get negative 9. So then f of h of negative 3, That means, remember, you go inside out. So h of negative 3 is equal to negative 9. So now f of negative 9 is equal to 4 times negative 9 minus negative 9 squared. So it's negative 36 plus, sorry, minus 81, which is equal to negative 117. All right, the next one, f of g of a plus b, I've written out on the side here. So notice the first thing you do is put a plus b into the g function, and you get 5a plus 5b minus 3. Then you put that into the f function, which means you're going to multiply it out. So if you notice, 4 times 5a plus 5b minus 3 minus 5a plus 5b minus 3 squared. So here's 5a minus 5 plus 5b minus 3 squared. So notice you get 25a squared plus 50ab minus 30a plus 25b squared minus 30b plus 9. But then remember, you have to subtract that, so you have to distribute the negative sign into all of that. And then you combine like terms, so that is your final answer. Just a lot of multiplication. Number 13. So you do g of 0 first. Well, g of 0 is negative 3. Then h of negative 3 is negative 9. Then h of negative 9 is still negative 9. And g of negative 9 is 5 times negative 9 minus 3. So it's negative 45 minus 3, which is negative 48. 14, f of r plus s. So you go 4 times r plus s minus r plus s squared. So it's 4r plus 4s minus r plus s squared is r squared plus 2rs plus s squared. Distribute the negative. And there you go. Final answer. Number 15. I also have written out on the side here because of spatial issues. So g of x plus delta x. So x plus delta x goes in for t. So you distribute the 5, and then you get 5x plus 5 delta x minus 3. So 16. So you have g of delta x plus x because you did that previously. So that's 5x plus 5 delta x minus 3. Minus g of x, which is 5x minus 3, all over delta x. So then you distribute the negative. And then you cancel like terms that can cancel out, like the 3 and negative 3, 5x and 5x. So you get 5 delta x over delta x, which is just equal to 5. Number 17 is similar with the f function, and I've written that one out already. So I'll scroll over to 17 here. Let me zoom in or out. So you have f of x plus delta x minus f of x all over delta x. So you substitute in, this is f of x plus delta x, and then this is f of x. So you substitute in. Now here, when you square it, you got to distribute the negative sign, and then you cancel out like terms like the 4x and the 4x, then minus x squared, the plus x squared. So then you're left with 4 delta x minus 2x delta x plus minus delta x squared. So you can factor out a delta x, and then that cancels with the denominator, and that's why you're left with 4 minus 2x minus delta x. What values are not allowed under radicals? Well, negative numbers. So this means that underneath the radical is greater than or equal to 0. What value is not allowed in the denominator? That's 0. This also means that the denominator cannot equal 0. So if we talk about domain and range, for number 18, is this a function or not a function? It is a function. The domain is all real numbers because it's a quadratic. But the range, we go greater than or equal to 0 plus 4. So that means it's going to be greater than or equal to 4. Because 0 plus 4 is 4. Infinity plus 4 is still infinity. For number 19, it is also a function. I'm just going to put an F for function. The domain is all real numbers. You can put anything in the absolute. And the range, we're going to do the same thing, except now we have negative 3. And then greater than or equal to 0 plus 1. So we have negative 3 times 0 is 0, but negative 3 times infinity is negative infinity. But then we're adding 1, so it's negative infinity to 1. That's the range. Number 20 is a circle, so it's not a function, NF. The center of the circle is 3, 2. The radius is the square root of 24, which is 2 rad 6. So the domain of a circle, you look at the x-coordinate and you subtract and add the radius. So it's 3 minus 2 rad 6, 3 plus 2 rad 6. And the same thing for the range, except with the y-coordinate. You go 2 minus 2 rad 6. And 2 plus 2 rad 6. Number 21. Square root function. So remember, the domain is under the rad, has to be greater than or equal to 0. So 3x is greater than or equal to negative 4. X is greater than or equal to negative 4/3, which means it's negative 4/3 to infinity. So then the range, it's 2 times greater than or equal to 0 minus 1. So it's going to be greater than or equal to 0 minus 1. So it's going to be negative 1 to infinity for the range. And it's a function. Number 22 is a function. It's a line, so that means the domain is all real numbers. And the range is also all real numbers. Number 23 is an ellipse. The center is still 3, 2. But now for the x, you take the square root of 4, which is 2. And for the y, you take the square root of 9, which is 3. So for the domain, this is not a function. For the domain, you go 3 minus 2, which is 1, and 3 plus 2, which is 5. For the range, you go 2 minus 3, which is negative 1, and 2 plus 3, which is 5. All right, this is a parabola, so if you add 7, it's a function. And so the domain, remember, is all real numbers. The range, you're going to have 4 times 0 to infinity plus 7. So it's going to be 0 to infinity plus 7. So it's going to be 7 to infinity. The hyperbola here is not a function. The center is 3, 2. Remember, because x is first, if the center is 3, 2, then this tells you to go to the left. So their parabolas are going to go sideways. And then to the right, and the parabola is going to go sideways again. So the domain is negative infinity to 1, union 5 to infinity, and the range is all reals. (26) is a function. The domain is going to be greater than or equal to negative 7. And the range, when you put in 0 to infinity, it's going to flip, so it's less than or equal to 0, and then when you subtract 8, it's going to be less than or equal to negative 8. For 27, it is a function. The domain is all real numbers. And the range, when you put greater than or equal to 0, 4 times that doesn't change anything. But then minus 3 makes it's greater than or equal to negative 3. 28 is a fraction that's a function. The domain, remember, the denominator cannot equal 0, so 3x plus 5 cannot equal 0. X cannot equal negative 5/3. So it's negative infinity to negative 5/3. Union negative 5/3 to infinity. The range, well, if you take the limit as x approaches infinity of the function, observe highest power, you get 4/3. So that is what x cannot, or y cannot be. Y cannot equal 4/3. So the range is from negative infinity to 4/3, union 4/3 to infinity. And last but not least, 29 is also a function. And doing the reverse, so now the range is what makes the denominator equal to 0, and in that case, y cannot equal 5/2, which means negative infinity 5/2 union 5/2 to infinity. The domain, you take the limit of the function, so that means x cannot equal negative 3/2, so it's negative infinity to negative 3/2 union negative 3/2 to infinity. All right, we will finish up the video, the notes with the next video. So it's coming in a little bit. Have a good evening.